Hey everyone, thanks for being with us again. When I was a kid, I was not very much of an athlete, unless you consider band to be a sport. But when I was in elementary school, my primary physical activities were tree climbing and riding my bike. I rode my bike a lot. And the bike that I have the fondest memories of, I actually got a used bike when I was in about 4th grade. And it was a Schwinn Stingray Fastback, circa 1971. It looked exactly like this one, right down to the split in the seat. But it had those spider bike handlebars with the handbrakes and that 5-speed gear shift on the center bar that looked like it belonged in a race car. And so I felt pretty cool cruising around on that thing, no hands, no helmet. But then sometimes I would go to shift into a new gear and it wouldn't work. And the chain would slip and get caught in between sprockets, or something would happen and the pedals would just grind and lurch, and I couldn't move forward anymore. And so I would have to pause, get off the bike and stop and look to see if I could figure out what exactly was broken and messed up, which could have been any number of things on an old bike like that. Well, it kind of feels to me like the entire world over the last few months has slipped out of gear. Everything is difficult and grinding and lurching, like it's not moving properly. We keep getting one problem after the other, and we go to address it, and it's not working. Everything seems to be unraveling to some degree. And in the middle of this pause, we've had to look at some brokenness that has become apparent, and is particularly in this area of racism that is so rampant. And that is, this is an old bike. This is not a new problem, but because of this pause that we're in the middle of, it's moved more towards the forefront of needing attention. And I'm so grateful as we are confronting this that we are going through this book of Nehemiah, because Nehemiah gives us this picture of people who are in the middle of their own restoration project, facing their own problems. And it's so timely. Last week we saw Nehemiah addressing the oppression and the injustice that was happening in their own community. And what's so hopeful about it is that the people owned and acknowledged what he confronted them about and said, we'll change, we'll do what you're saying. And so they committed to this new track moving forward. And as we emerge from this season, whenever that is, and we are moving forward, my hope is that we won't just go, oh good, we're back to normal, but that we will come out of this as changed people who are ready to shift into a new gear to address the things, everything that God draws to our attention during this pause, that we are able to own and acknowledge the things that he brings up for being addressed. So to that end, I would like to take a moment to just have you pause the video right now, and before we get into our text for today, just take a minute to pray for our world, our nation, our church, and all the things that we are seeing that are needing God's mercy on. And I realize praying together, if you're with your family, may feel foreign to you. I'd encourage you to try it. But if that is too uncomfortable, at least take a moment to sit and pray silently together where you're at. And also, let's just invite the Lord as you're praying to speak to us today, to show us what he would want us to see in his word as we go back to Nehemiah. We're picking up the story today in Nehemiah chapter 6, and the wall is beginning to near completion, and Nehemiah tells us what's happening. He says this: when word came to Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies that I had rebuilt the wall and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I had not set the doors and the gates. Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message: "Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono." But they were scheming to harm me. So I sent messengers to them with this reply: "I am carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you?" 4 times they sent me the same message, and each time I gave them the same answer. If that all sounds really familiar, it's because it is. We first met this little group of Nehemiah's enemies back a few chapters ago when they were already making life difficult for Nehemiah. And we said at the time that we can kind of expect the same sort of opposition ourselves as Christians as we begin to engage in this great mission that Christ has given us to live out of being loved by God and to love each other well. Of course, we're going to experience the enemy's opposition to that, because it's the one thing that Christ said is how the world will identify us as his followers, is if we're loving each other. And so we can expect that there's going to be resistance to that. That's not new to this chapter. What's maybe different or stands out here is the fact that this was so relentless on Nehemiah. Things just kept coming at him, and we see that even in these first few verses, and we'll see more of it in the rest as we read the rest of the chapter. But even here, they kept coming at him with the same question. 4 times Nehemiah says they just were coming back and back and back, and he was having to deal with this over and over and over. And it reminds us that for us, the struggle is also very daily. It's ongoing. When I was a kid growing up, there was a popular little church song that said, "Every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before." Well, that has not been my experience of the faith. If anything, it's been every day with Jesus is pretty much the same as the day before. Maybe even sometimes a little bit more difficult than the day before. And that's not to take away from all the goodness of having Christ in my life and all the ways that he improves my experience, but he doesn't stop the struggle just because he is with us. We're needing to face that ongoing. I think during this time of quarantine, it's especially been highlighted for me. I just feel like I'm reminded of that song where we said that we've done so often in worship of "I need thee every hour," because there is this moment by moment need for Christ during this time where nothing is working quite right. It feels like it takes my brain more to work around issues, and everything is heightened for my emotions being raw and on edge during this intense period. And so I'm constantly having to seek out God's care, and I'm reminded of the author of Lamentations just saying he's so thankful that God's mercies are new every morning, because we need that, because it is a daily struggle. And not only is the struggle daily, but these big issues that we're confronting, such as racism that we've been talking about the last few weeks, it's not enough to just preach a few sermons or go to a protest or post a few things on your social media. These issues are so broken, they are requiring a daily engagement, an ongoing commitment on our part to say, yes, I'm going to work further on this to know how we can love each other really well in this area. And so there is this deep sense in which the struggle for us is daily, and being aware and ready for the fact that there's going to be opposition that's ongoing for us is so important. And I love the way that Nehemiah addressed that opposition, where he just told his enemies that he didn't have time to deal with them. He wasn't even going to argue with them, because he said, I don't have time. I'm all about this work, and I've got to stay on it because it's got to get done. He knew who he was. He was well differentiated, and he was not going to be distracted. And here's where this way that we have decided that we're going to read through the book of Nehemiah seems so important to me, because we've said that that we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the people of Jerusalem, the people needing the rescue and the rebuilding, and we're seeing Christ in the role of Nehemiah, that Nehemiah represents a picture of Jesus for us, that we can learn more about Jesus as we look at him. And I see that as we are finding this struggle to be so daily, that what Nehemiah shows us is that Christ himself is undistractable. Christ is undistractable. As I read this chapter, it seems to me that what Nehemiah is dealing with is not so much just opposition in general, but specifically the idea of temptation. He is being enticed away from what is his mission, and he's not going to let that happen. And to me, this chapter parallels, in many ways, the story of Christ's temptation in the wilderness, where the enemy is trying his best to pull Jesus off his mission of going to the cross. He is showing him all these other things that might be a different way to direct his energies. And so it is so good for us to know that Christ was impervious to those temptations, that he was and still is all about his mission of doing his Father's will and bringing salvation for us. And we'll unpack that more as we get further into the chapter. But for now, just to make a note of the fact that as this struggle is daily, this struggle where we are daily prone to distraction ourselves, to know that the power and presence that we have with us of Christ, that he himself is not distracted, cannot be distracted, and will not stop until he has completed the work within us that he's begun. So let's look at the next section of this chapter and see the opposition that Nehemiah came up against next. It says this: Then the fifth time, so this is after the 4 times that they've approached Nehemiah with the same question, come back a 5th time, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and in his hand was an unsealed letter. An unsealed letter meant that it would have been intended for the public to catch wind of what the contents were. So an unsealed letter in which was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem says it's true, that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you're building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king, so come, let us confer together." I sent him this reply: "Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You are just making it up out of your head." They were trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work, and it will not be completed. But I prayed, "Now strengthen my hands. Now strengthen my hands." I love that line. I see it as really being the heart of this chapter. And the enemy here has raised this idea that the people of Jerusalem are weak. We don't really like that word. It's a weak word, right? We don't really want to be associated with it. I want to take a couple minutes, though, and have you think. You can group think if you're watching this with other people, but think for a minute of as many words as possible. List them all out that you can, that you associate with the word weak. We'll set the timer for 2 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll compare lists. come up with a good list? I want to read for you the words that I came up with that I associate with weakness. Helpless, tired, hurt, confused, sick, vulnerable, uncertain, overwhelmed, afraid, distressed, brittle, exposed, anxious, incapable, desperate, burdened, powerless, stretched, small, breakable, limited, emotional, compromised, susceptible. I'm sure you came up with your own list and some different words than I came up with. But the point is, we don't really like to be associated with those words. We don't like the idea of being perceived as weak. It's just human nature that goes against everything within us. So even when somebody asks how we're doing, we're likely to gloss over it and say we're doing good, even if we're not really. We don't want other people to see that kind of weakness in us. And so when we get talking about big level brokenness out in the world and looking at how that might be affecting us personally, we really resist that and back away from it. You know, talking about things like racism, I don't want to look at that possibility that I might have some racist tendencies in my own heart. I'm going to push back hard against that idea. And so I might even scramble to do some things to prove that I am not that way. And so I don't want anybody to see any signs of weakness within me. Well, that's true in the church as well, and it hinders us. Kate Shellnut, who is an editor at Christianity Today, said this: "Despite preaching about the reality of sin, we have been too reticent to see it in our own lives and too often downplay its effects on an institutional and societal level. If we can't admit to the weakness, then we can't really address it and deal with it, and we can't allow grace into that area. If it's off limits, then God's work can't really take hold in our hearts." What I see in Nehemiah, when he makes that statement, "Now strengthen my hands," he's not fighting what the enemy is suggesting, that the people are weak. He's not going out to everybody and saying, "Let's prove them wrong. Let's show them that we are really strong." Instead, he's making this appeal to God for strength, which would imply that, in fact, he's admitting that there is some weakness there. There is a need there. And so he is stepping into that, and then as a result can receive what God has for him. So I think rather than seeing weakness as something to avoid, I see weakness as being an invitation. Weakness is an invitation because we can flip it around and make it meaningful. We can say, this is a place, now that I recognize that this is going on here, then I can invite God into it and see what he does. This can be a place to have God's glory be seen that it might not otherwise. I think the classic example in Scripture is the story of Paul and his thorn in the flesh and his wrestling with that, and that being a weakness. And here's what he says in the Message version. It says, "At first, I didn't think of it as a gift and begged God to remove it. 3 times I did that. And then he told me, 'My grace is enough. It's all you need. My strength comes into its own in your weakness.' Once I heard that, I was glad to let it happen. I quit focusing on the handicap and began appreciating the gift. It was a case of Christ's strength moving in on my weakness. Now I take limitations in stride, and with good cheer. These limitations that cut me down to size, abuse, accidents, opposition, bad breaks, I just let Christ take over. And so the weaker I get, the stronger I become." Paul discovered something that Nehemiah had discovered as well, which was this: When we look at our weaknesses differently, when we don't see it as something just to avoid or distance ourselves from, and instead we recognize it and see the opportunity within it and own it, then we can bring that to God and say, I'm weak here, God. Will you please strengthen my hands? And then that becomes a place where he can meet us and do something incredible. Weakness is an invitation. And not only is it an invitation, but Christ accepted it. Christ accepted that invitation on our behalf. He accepted it when he chose to take on the form of a servant and become human. He chose it when he took up our infirmities. He chose it when he prayed that prayer in the garden, not my will, but yours be done. He chose it when he refused to respond to his accusers. He chose it when he turned the other cheek for the people who were beating him. He chose it when he stayed on the cross when he could have come down. And he chose it when he went to the grave. And then he took those nail-scarred palms, held them before his Father, and said, now strengthen my hands. And God raised him from the dead. And that is the ultimate way in which God takes our weakness and transforms it and does this amazing thing with it. Christ accepted the invitation that's found in weakness, and he offers us all the life that came out of that. Paul wrote to the Corinthians and said, for to be sure, he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by God's power. Likewise, we are weak in him, yet by God's power, we will live with him to serve you. The resurrection changes everything. Having the power of the risen Christ at work in my heart and your heart, it gives us a hope beyond anything else, because having seen what he did with Christ means that we can have full confidence that he can transform our weakness into something new. The fact that Christ accepted that invitation means that we too can enter into our weakness and say to God, now strengthen my hands. Well, Nehemiah's opposition continued in this chapter. Take a look at the next verses. It says, one day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was shut in his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. But I said, should a man like me run away? Or should one like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me, because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. He had been hired to intimidate me so that I would commit a sin by doing this, and then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Here's another example of a temptation for Nehemiah, because he's being asked to misuse the temple for his own protection, to hide behind it. And he says, I'm not going to do that. If God's called me to this work, I'm going to be out there and trust that he's going to take care of me. It takes courage to be weak or vulnerable, if you will. It doesn't take courage to be strong. It takes courage to stay in that spot where we're not going to protect ourselves, we're not going to defend ourselves anymore, and we're going to wait for Christ and see what he's going to do. The churches in Hong Kong came together recently and wrote a document. Throughout all the human rights violations that have been happening there, the church, by and large, has remained silent. And they have recognized that that wasn't what they were called to do. And in this just remarkably candid and transparent letter, they confessed to this. And here's what they said. They said, when facing the authorities' strong governance and the persecution and suppression towards the dissidents, churches often chose to protect themselves. They engaged in self-censorship and remained silent towards the evil deeds of the authority, with their only wish being the smooth and uninterrupted operation of church ministries. And they went on from that in the letter to commit themselves to bearing witness to Emmanuel, God with us, God with those who are suffering, and to be there with them in the hardship. That is a letter of remarkable courage that the rest of the church around the world could learn from, and what it takes to have the courage to be weak and wait for Christ. That is what we need right now. A.W. Tozer said, "A scared world needs a fearless church." A scared world needs a fearless church. That's what we want to be, isn't it? We want to be a fearless church. What is a fearless church? It's one that's not afraid to look at its own weakness, to be transparent about it, to own it unflinchingly, and to wait for Christ in it, to see how he shows up in it and not try to run to our own defenses. That's what the world is needing to see in the church right now. Well, as the story continues, I want to read one more section out of this chapter for you. Nehemiah writes and says, "So the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized that this work had been done with the help of our God." Over the past several chapters, we've seen again and again how these people are being characterized as feeble or weak or unqualified. We looked at all their professions, and none of them were stonemasons. They didn't bring the skill set you would want brought to a work party. And yet, these are the people that God chose to build this wall. And now, on the far side, we can begin to see why. That it was precisely because of their weaknesses and because of the fact that they didn't bring anything to the table that they were the ideal candidates for this, because then God is the one who got the credit and the glory and the honor from all the surrounding nations. They looked at this and said, there is no reason why these people should have been able to do this apart from the living God being on their side. And it was this great testimony to God's power. And the same is true for us, that those places that are the points of weakness for us are the very places where God can receive the most glory and honor, because the world looks at it and says there's no reason why there should be any good there, because they're not the ones bringing anything to the table. Only God could do what we're seeing. In our Tuesday night group this last week, Janet Massey shared a story about her friend Rajan, who lives in India. And when Rajan was 12 years old, he and his family converted from Hinduism to Christianity. And when that happened, the rest of their family, who's Hindu, cut them off as though they were dead. They actually conducted these funeral ceremonies to say that they were no longer going to have contact with them. And this one aunt in particular really cursed their family and didn't want anything to do with them. Well, a number of years went by, and Rajan really had no contact with her, and he wasn't sure how she would react to him, but he heard that her son had gotten really sick and had this tumor and had gone through one round of treatment, and then it had come back. And Rajan was really concerned about them, and he wanted to reach out, but he wasn't sure what she would think. And finally, he called her up, and her voice was very low. She was very skeptical. But he said, "You know what? I just wanted to reach out and check in on you. I'm concerned about you, and I love you. And I've been out of work for 9 years, so I can't offer any money. But if there's anything I can do, would you please let me know?" And she began to weep and could not believe that he had reached out. And they had been abandoned by friends, and there was nobody who was really coming around them. And she said to him, "I never expected you to call me this day. Your God is so good." She could see the hand of Christ behind Rajan, enabling him to move past the years of hurt, to reach out to her, to transform the cursing into blessing. And she said, "Your God is so good." He corrected her and said, "No, our God is so good. He is the Lord of love, and that is what is enabling me to love in return." What an awesome story. What a powerful testimony to the way in which when we love each other, it shows who Christ is. The way that he can take our weakness and transform it. That when The strength comes from God. The glory goes to God. This last week was the funeral service for George Floyd, and person after person who got up to speak made mention of the fact that George was just an ordinary guy. He had his flaws, plenty of them. He had lots of ups and downs in life. He is not somebody that you would look at and point to and say, oh, I want him to be the poster child for justice or racial reconciliation. And yet, through him, God has captured the attention of the whole world to the need for justice. He has raised this cry and used it in a way that no one would have imagined. Makes me think of Paul's words to the Corinthians when he said, God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. The very first song that was sung at the funeral was an old Andre Crouch song that has one line in it that says, the blood that gives me strength from day to day, it will never lose its power. That's where our strength is. We are all the weak things of this world that God has chosen. And it is because Christ chose to enter into our weakness with us that we can find strength for whatever it is we're facing. What is it for you today that you are up against that has you feeling helpless and tired and overwhelmed and confused? Can you bring it to God and sit with it and say, strengthen my hands for whatever it is that's before you that you feel inadequate to the task? Can you ask God to enter in and transform your weakness and show his strength? God, we do just invite you in this morning for everything that's before us as a church, as a nation, as a world. It's too big, God. There is no way we can do it on our own. And we acknowledge that before you. And we say, God, strengthen our hands. Strengthen our hands and come and move in us and through us so that the world around us will see and say, your God is so good. It's in your name we pray. Amen.